everyone with an interest in NASH or, more broadly, fatty liver disease, Surf's Up, Season 3, Episode 55 of Surfing the NASH Tsunami, our wrap-up episode from last week's 2022 liver meeting, starts now.
This week on Surfing the NASH Tsunami.
Patients report that 80% of them felt they were given none or not enough information at diagnosis, and 1 in 3 felt they did not understand their condition at all.
Very few know that obesity and diabetes also can lead to cirrhosis without any alcohol, and this is very important to educate.
Primary care doctors are going to be more willing to treat diabetes and obesity, knowing that they have NASH with drugs that work in NASH if they realize that they are at higher risk of cirrhosis.
Biopsy and biopsy out may not be the gold standard if we've got great NIT in, great NIT out.
If somebody thought about liver biopsy, you get an enrichment.
For other non-invasive tests we have, like the NAFLD fibrosis score, they're completely useless in a pediatric population.
The oversimplification historically had been that this was a disease of the overweight and the obese and the older. And I think the more we look, the more we learn that's just not true. But not true because too simple.
Last week, roughly 7,000 hepatologists and hepatology stakeholders gathered in Washington, D.C. for the Liver Meeting 2022, the first in-person AASLD with on-site attendees in 3 years. Please join hepatology researcher and key opinion leader Professor Jörn Schattenberg, pricing and forecasting guru Roger Green, and today's guests, clinical researchers and key opinion leaders Professors William Alazawi, Naim Alkhouri, Laurent Castera, and Ken Cusi, and patient advocate Wayne Eskridge, as they review some of the highlights and key issues from last week's conference on Surfing the NASH Tsunami.
So, Liver Meeting 2022 is now in everybody's rearview mirror. I believe everybody's made it home to where they started. We've got folks with us today. First time in 162 episodes of this podcast. We have 2 people in Mountain Standard Time on the podcast at the same time. Naim, because he's in Alkhouri, because he's in Arizona, and that's now on Mountain Standard Time, and Wayne Eskridge, because he's in Idaho, which is always on Mountain Time. And then, along with that, we have Laurent Castera with us, who's in Paris, and Ken Cusi, who is in Florida. And Jörn Schattenberg just made his way in. We weren't sure how that technology was going to work, but he appears to be here. And Will Alazawi from London will be joining us in a minute. Many countries, many time zones. Lots of fun. Hello, everybody. Naim, how are you today?
I'm good. How are you, Roger? I'm just recovering from the meeting. It was a busy one in a good way.
Totally agree with that. And let me say hi to Jörn, who is actually driving. We can see him driving in the dark. Jörn, how you doing?
Yes, I'm great. I hear you guys, and I apologize for this little inconvenient setup.
Ken, welcome.
How are you, Roger? Good to hear again from you.
Just fantastic. Ken and I have been talking a lot recently. I'll have an announcement on what that's about in the next couple of weeks, but it's going to be good. Wayne, how are you?
Very good, Roger. Happy to be here.
And Wayne and I have been talking a lot recently, and I'll have an announcement on that in the next couple of weeks. And then finally, our first-time guest today is Laurent Castera from France. Laurent, how are you today?
How are you, Roger? Good to be with you.
Delighted to have you with us. Laurent and I discussed this briefly in Dublin at the NAFLD Summit, and then when I was invited him last week, he was good enough to join us, which is just fantastic and a real honor. So, Laurent, I think our audience probably knows of you. You can't have read literature in this specialty and not know of you, but I'm not sure that they know about you. So can you do us a favor, take a couple of minutes, tell us a little bit about yourself, your work, your history, how you came to be doing what you're doing today. And then when you're done, I'll have one more question for you.
Okay, so I'm a French hepatologist based in Clichy at Beaujon Hospital and also at Paris University. I started working on non-invasive tests quite a while ago in the early 2000s with the FibroScan at that time and then with some biomarker. And to make a long story short, of course, we can see now the importance of NIT to select or diagnose patients with NASH and probably very likely in the future to monitor treatment or to decide for treatment indication. And this is the way I came to NASH. What else can I tell you? So when I was a resident, this was a while ago, about 30 years ago, I lived for 1.5 years in a remote island in the South Pacific, and I was in third world medicine. The reason was, at that time in France, we had to do your military service, and this is how I ended up in Vanuatu, a very remote place, but a fantastic place.
Vanuatu is one of these places I've heard about forever and have always wanted to get to and have not been able to, so
you should.
I think you've just whetted my appetite to figure out how to get get there. Thank you very much for that. One more parenthetical comment before we start, which is that since we've been doing this podcast, various hepatology key opinion leaders have told me that what they like to do is listen during long drives. But I'm realizing, Jörn, this is the first time anybody's ever listened during a long drive while he actually was on the podcast. So if anybody's to be a groundbreaker, it should be you. I think that's excellent. Stephen had threatened to do it once or twice in his pickup truck driving from San Antonio to Austin, but he never made that happen.
The important message is I'm not driving.
We feel much better to know that, so thank you. So with that, why don't we just get started? As usual, when we do wrap-up episodes, I've asked everybody to be ready to talk about one or two posters or presentations that they thought were particularly important during the conference. Let me just say, brave one, go first, and whoever wants to jump in, why don't you get us started?
This meeting was really a good one, but for us in the Fatty Liver Foundation, it was particularly a good one because we've been doing a survey of the patient view of what their experience has been. It's called the Annual Survey of Patient Perspectives to understand and monitor the evolving social and medical experience of non-alcoholic fatty liver disease patients in the United States. We see a lot of patient thoughts that are derived from within the medical community. They're part of care, and doctors survey, the system surveys patients quite a lot. But that is, in its own way, a fairly coercive environment in some ways because patients are always a little less willing to talk about exactly how they feel, we think. So we went out into the patient community and asked a whole bunch of questions about their experiences and how they feel about things. And this is to be a baseline for the community because as far as we know, this is the first one of this type that's been done. We have the treatments and development of NITs and the advancement of the field that's happening so fast that they're going to make this an annual survey so we can track how patients' experiences and attitudes change over time. So to give you just a sense of it, we all know the general statistics, that 24% of people that have it have NAFLD. The predicted very high increase up to 63% by 2030. This is particularly compounded by the COVID experience. Many patients experience unsatisfactory interactions with the healthcare system. We know this to be true. Exactly how we respond or how we attack those kind of problems, that's a subject that we focus on. So we're looking at data from the patient population as their lived experience. And the objective is to obtain information about the personal characteristics, decision-making, process of care, experience of care, outcomes from a patient perspective. We did this basically similar to other medical advisory models. So we think that it will be relevant to other surveys that have been taken. We got 713 responses included in the analysis. And these are all patients that report being diagnosed with NAFLD or NASH. Now, the population that we got was fairly typically biased, which we have to work on, but it was 74% female. Women respond better than men. The age distribution was out in the 50s, typically. Significant numbers of them were educated. It was about 70% white. We did get good response from the Latin American community. Had 18% from that community, which pretty much mirrors our society, but we're still going to need to find ways to deal with the Asian and the African Americans. But it is a good start. We ask about their journey, and 34% had their diagnosis begin with a visit to their PCP, but 31% was an incidental finding, which is a demonstration of the fact that we discover so many of these by accident and not by intent, which is a concern. The respondents were almost neutral to the statement, I was diagnosed at an early stage of disease. So half the people thought they were diagnosed appropriately or early, and the other half thought it was less so. The symptoms people reported are the typical ones that you'd expect, fatigue, abdominal pain, changes in sleep, changes in mood. But the things that caused us the most, there were revelations, I suppose. The amount of that the patients report that 80% of them felt they were given none or not enough information at diagnosis. 1 in 3 did not receive a referral to a specialist at diagnosis. And 1 in 3 felt they did not understand their condition at all after seeing a specialist. Now, those are big red flags for us as a patient community, because the patient we know is uneducated. We know that we believe from other studies that the physician community is not providing much information to patients. But the thing that I was most struck by is the 31% after visiting with a specialist reported that their understanding of their condition was not at all. And 29% reported somewhat. Only 12% reported that they completely understood their situation. And we think that certainly gives us things that we should care about. They reported an satisfaction with their care on a scale of 1 to 100 at 44%. So less than half of the patient population felt that they had a positive journey. We also looked at the care teams, and as you would expect, most of them involved their PCP. That's a significant number involved the gastro and the hepatology community, but the other services that we know people need to succeed at weight loss and lifestyle change, such as the nutritionists and psychological support and those other life kinds of services, were very poorly represented. 66 of the people that we interviewed said they had not been offered any kind of therapeutic help. There's also a very heavy burden on mental health. 50 out of 100, 50% of them report problems with their various aspects of their mental health. They didn't feel that they were getting good support with that. So that was concerning, because we don't do a lot with liver patients specifically to deal with anxiety, depression, and the irritability, although people have that at a very high level. And the data reflects that there's a big need for additional support on the care services.
So, Wayne, let me step in for a sec and ask if we were going to pull all this together for the audience that we deal with here, which is basically an audience of treaters and pharma and diagnostic company execs. What message would we want them to take away from the study?
Well, I think the biggest problem we have is really the two sides of the education information. Patients need education, but the doctors need to be better educated about liver disease. And I think those two things together lead to a lot of the difficulty we have.
Okay, so I'll ask the group a question and then we'll move, because something apropos of Ken and I have an announcement at some point. This has to do with issues around education. Do you think the education issue is in primary care and hepatology or in frontline treatment, not just primary care, but whoever's treating frontline in hepatology, or is the answer just everywhere? Wayne first, then physician responses.
I think the problem is across the board, because even the people reporting their visits with specialists, a significant number felt they did not get any information.
Go for it. Well, I'll just say hi, first of all. It's really salutary to hear that, Wayne. It's really important. And I think any clinician who listens to feedback like that really not only reflects on their specialty, but also on their own practice. So I'm really grateful to hear those messages. I'm going to step back and let Ken speak, because he has done a lot of work in this space, and then I'll jump in after.
Well, Will, you've done a lot of the studies in primary care. So I think you have the greatest authority. But just in a moment, just to take an analogy from the diabetes field as an endocrinologist, is that we were able to reduce the chronic kidney disease and dialysis in people with diabetes by having very clear guidance for primary care and endocrinologists on screening early with a urine test for albumin. So I think it took time, but now it's working. And I think that analogy of a simple test is where we are trying to head in the recent guidelines. Well, you did a lot of that with FIB4. I mean, why didn't you share what you learned?
The urine, I think, is very apposite here, because actually, if you have a test that is indicative of disease and that can be tracked and reflects real-time pathology, then I think although it's still a lot of work for the endocrine and diabetes community to have got everybody on board, it is a slightly easier task. Now, one of the things that we know is that in primary care, the drive, understandably, is not to overdiagnose, and therefore to only request the tests that are absolutely necessary. And therefore, the composition of liver enzymes and tests that are needed in order to calculate the scores that we currently have aren't things that you would do unless you are hunting for those specific scores. So you can't go back and retro-calculate the scores that you need. And what that means is that GPs already go into this with one hand tied behind their back, because actually, and Wayne, you'll know this better than me, that patients don't want to keep going back to the office for repeat sets of bloods. They want it once and done. And so I think we are in a position where in primary care and in other specialties, even in luminal gastroenterology, the idea of a panel that comprises both ALT and AST at the moment is only available when you're thinking liver fibrosis. Now, the other element of all of this, of course, is that when you have got a positive result, so even in that small proportion of individuals, Ken was talking about our primary care study, fewer than half the patients, less than half the patients, had even the data available in their electronic records, something like 12% in the UK, in order to calculate these scores. So not having that information at your fingertips is one thing, but then not knowing what to do with it afterwards is something else. Now, I know that if every single one of the specialties in medicine ask our GP colleagues, our PCP colleagues to do just one more test, why don't you just do my one test? They'd have 50 more tests and every consult would last an extra 45 minutes or so. So I think we need to be careful about the impact. So our job here, why we're doing this thing, talking to friends and colleagues from around the world, is to make that so what clearer and to make that messaging consistent about how easy it is to find out what's going on with your liver, and of course empower patients to ask the question. Again, let's copy Ken. Just as we empowered patients living with diabetes to say, what's my HbA1c?
Yeah, my last small comment is that this also explains how practices are a little bit different. In the United States, most people who are in a healthcare system would get once a year a comprehensive metabolic profile that has different things and usually would include the liver enzymes and a CBC. But it's most likely that in the majority of the world, that is not the case. So for us, it's a bit easier in the sense that we have to simply educate the people to build these equations in their medical records. But Roger, we're not letting you talk here.
But I think we've had this discussion with folks from a bunch of different countries, and the U.S. may be the only one where AST is standard, because it came up in the context of how hard would it be to get a FAST score. And part of it is you'd have to have a FibroScan, but the other part is AST is not standard anywhere, so you have to have reason to request it, except in the U.S. where, as you point out, it comes up on comprehensive blood work. In fact, one of the things that we've advocated on this podcast to our patient advocate friends outside the U.S. is that a key point of advocacy should be to press for AST to be standard for anybody with diabetes, because it just isn't the case right now. Laurent, do you get a standard AST in France, or do you have to specifically ask in the same sense that Will was describing?
The current situation in France, that we have this system called Social Security with free medical checkup. So it's a very well organized network all around France. There's been a large survey published now a couple of years ago regarding the prevalence of NAFLD in the population. And the downside of it, AST was not available in this cohort. It was based on 200,000 French people, and you could not calculate FIB4. So to approximate the prevalence of advanced fibrosis in the population, Ford's index was used, which is probably not the best test in this population because it includes cholesterol. So this is also an issue that I hope will be solved in the future. Actually, in these guidelines that were published last year in September in GEP, we really emphasize the need for including AST in the liver test. If I may add a little bit to the discussion we previously had regarding the lack of awareness of many doctors and patients as well in primary care. I mean, I'm sure everywhere it's the same. Most GP are over busy and liver is very low on their agenda. The reason is everyone knows alcohol can give liver disease, including cirrhosis, but very few know that obesity and diabetes also can lead to cirrhosis without any alcohol. And this is very important to educate educate, I think, the GPs. Another point is that in the absence of approved treatment, many GPs think that it's not worth screening for these patients. What I'm going to do? A reason is there is not clear pathway in place. And if you come first with a clear pathway, of course, we know this is FIB4 followed by VCTE. This, of course, is a different story. And I think for FIB4, you should use the AMDRD model, alluding to what Ken mentioned before, raising the awareness of GP regarding CKD in diabetic patients. AMDRD now is provided systematically in France by the lab, and we should use a very similar model, I think, for FIB4. And also, at the end of the day, even though a drug is not approved, still, if you're able to figure out the proportion of patients with advanced fibrosis, you're going to change the management. Because even in the absence of pharmacological treatment, you will start a surveillance program for these patients, including screening for HCC and portal hypertension. And this makes a huge difference because this is going to change the natural history of these patients.
Primary care doctors are going to be more willing to treat diabetes and obesity, knowing that they have NASH with drugs that work in NASH like pioglitazone or GLP-1, if they realize that they are at higher risk of cirrhosis. So I think that for primary care doctors and endocrinologists, it does make sense to find if they have NASH, because the message should be that they can do something about it now.
That sounds reasonable. So with that, who would like to jump to a paper that promises a better future in terms of what people can do about it?
I'm happy to do that. Well, first of all, I want to welcome Laurent. He's been really someone that I've been watching throughout my career. He's a great teacher. I always learn every time I hear him do a lecture. And then my good friend Will as well. He's done so much work, as you said, in the primary care setting and validating the pathways that we are trying to implement now. I would say it was a great meeting. I feel like good times are coming to NASH. We have positive energy on all the societies aligning on screening guidelines. We have new developments in non-invasive tests to not only identify high-risk patients in primary care, but also to identify patients with at-risk NASH that need pharmacologic treatment and then monitor them on treatment. Tests like the MIFIB and MAS that are making really an impact already in the context of clinical trials. And then, of course, therapeutics. I think this was a good meeting in NASH drug development. The one study I wanted to highlight is the resmetirom open label cirrhosis cohort with Madrigal. This was a study that included 105 patients with NASH cirrhosis, and they were treated with resmetirom for 52 weeks. There was no histologic endpoint or outcome endpoint. It was mainly looking at the impact on non-invasive tests, but we saw really very promising results in terms of reduction on liver stiffness by FibroScan, VCTE. We also saw a reduction on MR elastography. We also saw, of course, improvement in MRI PDFF and the CAP score. So I would say all the NITs are heading the right direction in a cirrhotic cohort, which is really the highest unmet need we have in the field. When you look at the percentage of patients that achieved meaningful reduction in VCTE by 25% or more, there was a good percentage in the 45 to 55% range. We also achieved that 19% reduction from baseline MRE values. So I'm encouraged. I think this is great news for our patients with NASH cirrhosis. Of course, there is the Maestro NASH cirrhosis trial that's ongoing that will randomize about 700 individuals to resmetirom versus placebo, treat them for 3 years and look for liver-related outcomes. This will really lead to hopefully FDA approval of NASH cirrhosis drugs if we can show actually that there is a difference in liver-related outcomes. Finally, I just want to say one thing about the screening pathways. We talked about the AGA pathway, the ACE pathway, and I like that they align on the cut points they use for FIB4 and transient elastography. And my sense is that the AASLD will also continue to align on these cut points. We did a study where we tried to evaluate the impact of implementing these pathways on a United States population level, where we started with patients with type 2 diabetes, metabolic syndrome, or elevated ALT, and then we implemented the FIB4, and if they had indeterminate values, we did a FibroScan. And we showed that by doing this, you only need to refer about 8% of individuals at risk for NAFLD to a hepatologist. So I hope that data provides reassurance to hepatology providers that we're not going to be overwhelmed with NAFLD patients, to insurance companies that we're when it comes to at-risk NASH, patients that need to be treated with expensive medicines, that this is relatively a smaller minority of patients. It's not the 95 million people with NAFLD, but rather maybe 4 to 5 million people with NASH and significant fibrosis.
Conceptually, it is very interesting. I mean, although sometimes one will be impressed to think that there's such a local hypothyroidism that would lead to significant benefit, but the evidence is proving that there is a space for treatment and improvement in histology with these compounds. Everybody is waiting to see if it really is of the magnitude that would give enough approval. So I think it's just a time now to wait and see if the biology matches the hypothesis that everybody has been watching in these recent years. But there is a reasonable amount of relationship that can make this work. On the other hand, again, we want to be cautious considering that we've had some disappointments in the past.
I just want to say one thing, as Ken alluded to, that there's maybe this hepatic hypothyroidism. I think, in the phase 2b study, in terms of histologic improvement with fibrosis, we didn't see a clear signal. So I wonder if this is just kind of improving that lipotoxicity environment in the liver and helping restore that thyroid balance at the liver level, where we actually just give the liver a chance to regenerate and improve itself and heal fibrosis. Maybe, I don't know if it's a direct effect of the drug or just improving the metabolic environment, but the fact that we saw clear reduction on MRE and on VCTE, that was actually important for me as a hepatologist. At least it's a signal.
Laurent, let me turn to you and ask to share with us one of the papers you thought was important or compelling in the meeting.
Yes, actually there were several papers I spotted. One was, of course, in my field of interest, that are NITs and diabetes. So this is a paper from the group of Rohit Lumba that was presented by Ajmera, and this was a screening study on patients with diabetes. So basically what they did, it was a prospective study. 500 diabetic patients, either seen in primary care or diabetes clinics, so two different settings. I think this is important to take into account. Why? Because the pretest probability, in other words, the prevalence of what you're looking at, especially advanced fibrosis or cirrhosis, will likely be different between primary care and diabetes clinic, where you expect it to be higher in diabetes clinic, of course. So what they did is using NIT, MRI-PDFF, and CAP to screen for these patients, and also MRE to screen for advanced fibrosis and cirrhosis. So to make a long story short, they ended up having around 65% of these patients with NAFLD, 14% with advanced fibrosis, and 5% with cirrhosis. The cutoff for advanced fibrosis was 3.63 on MRE at 8.8 kilopascal using VCT. Of this cohort, 164 underwent liver biopsy, and the interesting thing, of course, if you use liver biopsy, you're going to select your patient. It was not completely clear what were the indications for liver biopsy actually, and whether they were standardized or not on the AST or ALT. But they ended up having 61% of NASH, 30% of advanced fibrosis, and 9% of cirrhosis. And the interesting thing is we have been performing a similar study in a French cohort. So this is a multi-center prospective cohort. Our patients were slightly younger, 59 years old instead of 64, and 63% of male. In this cohort, it was 60% or more of female. But we end up with very similar result, that is the high prevalence, unexpected prevalence of advanced fibrosis in 30 to 38% of patients. In our cohort, actually, they all underwent liver biopsy, 360 patients, and with central reading, of which 330 qualify after central reading for adequate liver biopsy. But our results are very similar, as I mentioned before, 58% of NASH, 38% of advanced fibrosis, 10% of cirrhosis. The selection was slightly different because we did not use NITs. We just used very low threshold of transaminase, that is 20 for women and 30 for men. So I guess most diabetologists, correct me if I'm wrong, and probably some hepatologists, we consider them a normal transaminase. So meaning that in all comers, you have a high prevalence of advanced fibrosis. Last point, our cohort was exclusively for diabetes clinic, for diabetes clinic in the Paris area, where the Lumba study was a mix of primary care and diabetes clinic, but not completely clear what was the respective distribution of primary care and diabetes clinic patients, which might explain the discrepancy between the two findings. I'm sure, Ken, you would like to comment.
Well, these studies were incredibly important. The rate of NASH, not so much of NASH, but advanced fibrosis is a bit higher than definitely what you see in primary care in the United States and maybe in also our endocrinology clinic. Were these people particularly selected for duration of diabetes or for higher liver enzymes in the workup? I know you chose those lower end, but those who had a biopsy, were they just, if their liver enzymes were above a given level, they would get a biopsy, or they had to have a cutoff of liver stiffness or any other finding to go to a biopsy?
Sorry, your question is about our cohort or the Lumba cohort?
Both, but I didn't know exactly in the Lumba cohort if the biopsy was just standardized if you met a given parameter, because the rate of fibrosis, of significant fibrosis, is double of those cohorts in the United States.
So in the Lumba cohort, no, it was not clear because I asked the question. It was not standardized. In our cohort, it was standardized and not based on NIT, even though we perform NIT at the same time, but we didn't use them as an indication for liver biopsy. So it was mainly related to the acceptance of patients. Patients accepted, and to our surprise, we have been able to convince quite a bunch of patients.
So what was the criteria, Laurent? I mean, when would you tell somebody they needed to get, if the liver enzymes were above 20 in females or 30 in males?
With steatosis on ultrasound, yes, that is correct.
Wow. We will biopsy half of our people with diabetes or more, I mean, with that criteria. But it's very interesting. Maybe we are missing. We've done FibroScan in a large number of people, and by FibroScan, which we know is less precise in the lower end, we don't see that the value is above 7 in 80% of the patients, but we may be missing people, as you point out.
Laurent, what was the thinking behind setting the level that low?
No, the thinking was to say that if you look at the literature, it's very difficult to figure out what's going on. The UNOC meta-analysis published 2 years ago in GEP, just let me stress that it's based on a very limited number of liver biopsy for an obvious reason. And in most of cases, indications for liver biopsy is not clear, and it's mostly based on a pre-selection on NIT. But still in this meta-analysis, the prevalence of advanced fibrosis was 17%, but with a wide confidence interval, so a lot of variability, of course. But our results and the Lumba results are much higher, double than expected. So of course, it really depends on which population you're addressing. But I think this is just to put a red flag saying that we've probably been missing a lot of patients in the diabetes clinic, and there's clearly a large reservoir of patients in this setting. Then to answer Ken's question regarding FibroScan, in the cohort I mentioned, if we were to perform FibroScan first, we would miss around, depending of course on where you set the cutoff, we would miss around 25 to 30% with advanced fibrosis using the usual 8 kilopascal cutoff. So it's a bit worrying, meaning that you need to add to the liver stiffness probably metabolic parameters, and age as well, of course, makes a difference. In our cohort, the duration of diabetes, the median was 10 years, but it did not influence the result. It was not in multivariate analysis associated with advanced fibrosis, for instance. Even though we were expecting that A1C or duration of diabetes may impact, it did not.
Laurent said that 2 times, and he said that the indication for liver biopsy was not clear. So I think it's important for us to remember, what is the incentive for a physician to screen a patient or to enroll them? And that's so crucial because you get a totally selected population. And I think that comment he made twice is well taken. And it really needs an unbiased population in order to get up with these numbers and talk about true prevalence. And they're not wrong. If somebody thought about liver biopsy, you get an enrichment.
Yeah. In our cohort, anybody who had a FibroScan between 6.5 and 8 got an MRE. And the MRE also showed that they had had either no fibrosis or F1, occasionally F2. So there are clearly maybe some population differences, but I think the value, Laurent, is that you did a very systematic approach. And that's why we also tried to lower the ALT and the ACE guidelines to 30. And I know we chose one round number, although we know it should be lower in females to make it easier from a pragmatic point of view. And again, which is already low for what endocrinologists, primary care, and laboratories consider normal, right? So it's a work in progress.
If I may add a little comment, Ken, regarding your point. Another issue when you're using liver stiffness is the BMI. And you may have patients with BMI, let's say above 40. And in these patients, I do not trust the result of VCTE or even MRE, because they're always challenged. So this is probably, we need to reanalyze the data and look more in detail. But probably the subset of patients might not benefit from elastography. And this is maybe the one you're missing. You already have advanced fibrosis, but you're not able to capture because of the limitation of the technique. This is one of the explanations.
Yeah, Laurent, I have a question for you. So we know a lot about when FibroScan overestimates, whether it's higher BMI or very high ALT or congestive heart failure. But I really find it difficult to find the scenarios where FibroScan underestimates, where you have someone with F3, but then you get a stiffness of 6. Can you give us some insight on this? And is there like a phenotype that we need to be aware that maybe our FibroScan is underestimating? Because we always say FibroScan is great for negative predictive value. Be cautious with the positive predictive value. But these data make me also question the negative predictive value.
Okay, Naim. First, thank you very much for your kind words before. Just to answer your point, that is, I think, very important and critical. So in general, from the data we have in EPSI, but in EPSI, inflammation is not an issue. The negative predictive value of FibroScan is much higher than the positive predictive value. In NASH, I think the setting is different because inflammation is not like in EPI, but still is more important. And NASH probably is a confounding factor, as steatosis might be, or it's been suggested in some studies. And also the BMI is another confounding factor. So I'm not sure that the paradigm we've been using in viral hepatitis is completely true in NASH, and at least for my practice. So regarding the false positive, the VPP, as you know, in the two studies, the EDO studies and the CDK studies, is about 70%. So meaning that you end up with 30% of false positive, whereas, of course, the NPV is much higher, 80 to 90%. I think apart from the BMI, you have to be cautious also with steatosis and NASH. And to me, it's probably one of the explanations for the high rate of false positive. As false negative, it's a bit more tricky because usually, of course, if you have a 5 kilopascal, I would not go further in terms of exploration and would not go for liver biopsy or in very rare occasion because the NPV is so good. It's close to 97 or 8% that you're very unlikely to miss some patients. And this is also the tricky part of the study I mentioned before. When we analyze, this is not published yet, but the FibroScan data, even though, as I mentioned, they were not used for indicating liver biopsy, we still found false negative patients for F3 in this population.
I'm not really competent to delve into the details, but one thing I would like to comment on is that from a patient perspective, we're really pleased to see that the interest in the combination of diabetes and NASH has increased greatly over the last few years, and that's really important to us.
I think this kind of work, Laurent and Roger, is what we need to really raise the stakes for endocrinologists and primary care doctors to be more aggressive and more proactive and finding these people with NASH and diabetes and treating them today, because we have diabetes medications that work for NASH like semaglutide and pioglitazone, and also for obesity, which is the other major insult, right, with GLP-1. So great data, and I'm very excited that this is going to finally move the needle towards action.
Another positive development I witnessed, Roger, it's not in the meeting, but it happened at the same same time as LabCorp announcing that now you can get actually a reflex ELF test if you end up having a high FIB4 in a patient. So LabCorp implemented the FIB4 if you have a CBC and a CMP. They will give you the FIB4 results as part of the end result you get. But now they have a new code for a test where you do FIB4 and then ELF is a reflex test. This is similar to the paradigm we have in Hep C, where you do the Hep C antibody, and if it's positive, you get the HCV RNA. And I think this is going to be really a game changer because ELF is widely available, so we're not counting on the availability of FibroScan or MRI machines. And it happens in a reflexive way, so primary care physicians will have more confidence that if they're diagnosing someone with advanced fibrosis, that this is based on 2 NITs. So I hope that this will meet widespread successful use in practice.
So, Naim, I think that's really interesting because in the UK, you'll have heard that John Dillon in Dundee has set up what's called the Intelligent Liver Function, or ILIFT pathway. So that's exactly what you're just describing. An abnormal liver test goes through, if the ALT is up, a FIB4 is calculated, a liver etiology screen is performed, and an ELF test, if appropriate, that's the recent addition, is added on. And that sort of demystifies the abnormal LFT pathway. And of course, what we're trying to do here is make it simpler for primary care physicians to find the people with significant liver disease. And I think that's really important. I just have a slight concern that we should probably still expect the same level of evidence that we have with ELF that we've built up over the years with FibroScan and other, particularly MRE, with all the great work that you guys on the call have done. You know, one of the things that we probably ought to be aware of is whereas we have found differences in the accuracy of different NITs in people of South Asian ethnicity, we haven't seen that with transient elastography. And that data aren't available to us in ELF. So maybe what we need to do at pace is to see whether or not the ELF is as predictive in all different ethnic groups, in all different disease subsets. One might consider whether connective tissue disease is a consideration here. Just a thought, and then we'll have that data. I'm really sorry, on and off because of my very weak internet connection. You can make lots of jokes about the internet in Britain here, but I'll leave my European colleagues to laugh at me there. The one thing I did want to say was I came away from AASLD this year recognizing that more and more of my colleagues are seeing that what they really want to demonstrate is whether or not the NIT or compound NITs links to outcome. And a lot of it's moving away from the concept that the NIT must first map to the biopsy before we're allowed to see whether it maps to the outcome. And that, the game changer for me there is the more of our colleagues start talking in this way, the more the FDA, the more the regulators are going to start to realize that actually biopsy out may not be the gold standard if we've got great NIT in, great NIT out. And Naim, your work and the work of Mazen and colleagues and Steve, etc., I could list them all, really convinced me of that.
Well, thanks for that comment. Ken, I think you said something about coming back to the nomenclature at the end if we had a couple of minutes.
Well, I mean, the nomenclature was one issue. There are also some results of some drugs that were promising. So Naim mentioned resmetirom. We mentioned that today we have pioglitazone, but again, we don't like that there could be a dose-dependent weight gain with the lower dose causing 1% weight gain, less than a kilo, but the doses used in NASH of 30 or 45 milligrams, this weight gain can be 2 to 4%. So there's been an attempt to find a pioglitazone version 2 that would have all the good and none of the bad. And again, it's a tricky thing. You may have seen last year in the New England lanifibranor as a pan-PPAR. And in this meeting, the results of a phase 2b study with Poxel were reported with their compound, which is Poxel 065, which is a deuterium-modified thiazolidinedione. And basically, they took 117 patients and divided them in placebo and 3 groups from low, intermediate, and higher dose. And let me just step 1 minute on what they're looking for with this compound. So what they did is there's a mix of R and S enantiomers in pioglitazone that are rapidly interconverting. And what they've done here is modify that molecule with a deuterium introduction that stabilizes it into more of an R, which is this form that has benefits on mitochondrial function and metabolism, say, to be quick, compared to the S form, which is more what pioglitazone does and may be linked to more of that weight gain. So this deuterium stabilized enantiomer, PXL065, is meant to be as efficacious, having, for example, benefits on the mitochondrial pyruvate carrier and less of the other effects. So long story short, people were treated for roughly 9 months. And the most interesting finding was that they, in addition to some reductions in liver enzymes, which are comparable to with other agents, they found a pretty reasonable dose response in terms of reduction of liver fat that was up to 40% at the higher dose compared to 16.7 in the placebo arm. And they also found very interesting dose response improvement on fibrosis, which at the intermediate dose was 50%, somewhat lower in the higher dose compared to 17% on placebo. So that delta is larger than with other compounds and probably pioglitazone, and also some benefit on the 2-point change in the NAS score, which is again 50%, but only 30% on the placebo. So again, small numbers with 20 to 30 patients per arm, but going in the right direction. So this has led them to probably be very positive about future larger trial long-term studies. So interesting and in line with other PPAR, pan-PPARs and with pioglitazone. So we hope that it will go forward. And then the question is, what was the weight gain? And the weight gain was minimal at the lower and higher dose and about 2 kilos on the intermediate dose, but they had a lot of, in these small groups, outliers. So it's hard to tell if in the long term, this lower weight gain will be the issue, but it appears to be so. For example, they had less effect on adiponectin, which is a typical PPAR gamma effect, but still histological benefit. So exciting findings. And again, the field does need multiple agents with different mechanisms. There were also promising results with the FGF21 compound that you've been hearing from Akero. There is also another GLP-1 glucagon agonist, which was pemvidutide, a mitochondrial uncoupling compound, HU6. There's been a lot of different mechanisms that seem very promising. And for a complex disease like this one, we would like to take them all and help our people.
Thanks, Ken. Happily, I think we found our way to most of those, at least a little bit, once in the last 3 or 4 episodes. But as we're coming to the end, one of the things that was on my checklist for the entire conference that I don't think we've gotten to at all yet is pediatric NASH. And there was a bunch of stuff on that. And I wonder if Naim or anyone else would like to jump in and talk a little bit about that topic.
Yeah, that's a dear topic to my heart, Roger. And I was very pleased to see a few important abstracts, including in some of the plenary sessions. To be honest with you, I think it deserves an episode at the NASH Tsunami. We should do something because, the clinical trials will be also coming to pediatric, especially when you have drugs in a phase 3 program. They all have to develop a pediatric study plan. So, promoting an episode for pediatric NASH here. But I think the one abstract I may want to mention is that, as you may know, that FIB4, other non-invasive tests we have, like the NAFLD fibrosis score, they're completely useless in a pediatric population. We've shown that in several papers. People from Korea, from Italy, all showed that FIB4 does not perform well in a pediatric population. A few years back, I developed a score called the Pediatric NAFLD Fibrosis Score with a collaborator of mine, Valerio Nobili, and that was mainly in Italian children. We had a large cohort, biopsy-proven disease, but when I tried to validate it in the US, it did not do well. So at the meeting, Jeff Schwimmer group at UCSD presented data from the NASH Clinical Research Network, where they had over 1,100 kids with biopsy-proven disease, so you can determine the stage of fibrosis. And they developed a new fibrosis score for pediatric patients to predict F2 or higher. I do believe that this has great promise. Obviously, we need to externally validate it and also assess if changes over time. And this is something you can use for monitoring. But I'm optimistic that this could become a good screening tool and also a way to enrich pediatric clinical trials with patients with more significant disease.
I think it's an important topic because as we appreciate better the dimensions of this pandemic, there's been far more focus on lean NASH and on pediatric NASH. The oversimplification historically had been that this was a disease of the overweight and the obese and the older. And I think the more we look, the more we learn that's just too simple. And by the way, not true, but not true because too simple.
Well, Roger, I I interact a lot with pediatricians, and they're very worried about this epidemic of obesity and diabetes, and they're finding a lot of NASH. And again, we bring to the case that there are things to do in these children today. I mean, sometimes I feel this inertia, well, we don't have any approved drugs. Why would we screen? There are things we can do today. As you know, in the New England Journal of Medicine, just a couple of weeks ago, tirzepatide had a significant impact in reducing obesity and normalizing liver enzymes in larger cohort of children between age 12 to 18. So there are things we can do now, and it is very encouraging that we have pharmacotherapy to treat them. As you know, tirzepatide is undergoing a NASH trial in adults, but I guess this could be rapidly applied to youngsters if the results turn out to be positive.
I'm mindful of the idea that Naim's friends at Cleveland Clinic did Splendor, which we had an episode on last December, but Naim unfortunately wasn't able to join, but Ali Yaminian was there. And what they suggested is that if you can lose and maintain 20% weight loss through bariatric surgery, you can actually regress fibrosis a significant amount of the time. So as we start thinking about kids who have type 2 diabetes, which is really a horrible thing if you think about it, and the levels of obesity, certainly anything that creates weight loss in those patients, as with adults, has to be a good thing.
I have a question here. So thinking back at the guideline presentation by Mary Ranella, she started out saying that peds are taking out Naim. Do you think that's a good thing at this point because we're going to get an in-depth peds guidance, or is that a disadvantage for the peds because they don't have anything to hold on to yet? I'm not sure you noticed that, but in the presentation they said this is not covering pediatric NASH.
Well, I have some good news for you, Jörn. Number one, it's good that they're going to take it seriously and in depth. But in the meantime, ACE in our guidelines, in the end, we did address what we know about peds. So there is somewhat of a guideline that can help primary care doctors and endocrinologists. But I agree, Jörn, you're concerned that we should be taking this more to the forefront. And I'm fully supportive of that view. Just want to make a brief comment for parents who may be hearing and may be worried about diabetes. It's not a horrible thing. It's something that we don't want, but it's never been a better time to have diabetes, if you can put it some way, than today, because we have really diagnostic and treatment approaches that can really prevent 100% the complications of diabetes. So the complications we see today of kidney disease, eye disease, those are for what we failed to do in the past. But today, if you are diagnosed with diabetes, you can have a completely normal life and have no complications and live a long and fulfilling life. So I just want to inject hope because we've made a lot of progress in the last 10 years.
Before I go to you, Naim, point well taken. I didn't mean to imply otherwise. What I meant simply to imply was that we talked in one of the previous episodes recently about all the different ways that diet and things that we put in the atmosphere have affected intestinal flora in significant ways, and the interplay between that and changes in global diet and increases in obesity. It's not a good thing. I mean, it's great that we can treat the problems that result from it, but on that one issue, at least, it wouldn't be a bad thing if you could turn the clock back 50 years and just not do some of the stuff that we've done. And I think that was more what I was connecting to. Naim, go ahead.
In Splendor, we actually excluded the cirrhotic patients, but this is the next project we're doing. So we will have that data for you on the regression of fibrosis in cirrhotics.
So with that, we are to the bottom of the hour, and we've lost Will, who's had significant bandwidth problems all the way through this, but we've got everybody else. So this is the question I've been asking. I keep getting the same answer. I'm going to rule out the answer that goes, we will have drugs next year, because that's the answer we get every time we ask this question. Once we go past the idea that we're hopeful that we will have drug approvals next year already or well on the way, what is the other biggest change you expect to see in how we think about or treat this disease when we all reconvene next year for Liver Meeting 23? Brave one, go first.
Well, I don't know that it's brave, but let me get ahead of you. Then you guys can have some learned talk. One of the things that I see that it gratifies me immensely is that the umbrella, the definitions of things that are being studied in the milieu of NASH is widening out dramatically. I think the PEDS is a good discussion. The lean NASH that Roger just briefly mentioned is a huge problem. A year from now, we will see a broader field of study about liver disease and the comorbidities that go around it.
My quick comment here is I think that, all the good work my colleagues have been doing in non-invasive biomarkers, including Laurent, who's joined us today, Kenneth, obviously, with all his guidelines works, I think we'll see FIB4 emerge as a standard test to be ordered in diabetic clinics to identify patients that are referred for additional testing. And I think this type of practice patterns will emerge even stronger. And I'm very hopeful for that.
That would be fantastic. Ken is smiling and clapping quietly as you say that.
Jörn, very happy. Jörn always has brilliant ideas. What else can come from his mouth? But what I would like to see is that, again, that all the guidelines have kind of accepted the FIB-4 with the, limitations, but initial screening value. I would be happier, and I think this is going to happen, if we get primary care doctors, endocrinologists, and hepatologists to treat diabetes and obesity now. But, not just with a pat in the back and, go see the endocrinologist, but everybody get on the same page and really be very, very proactive in prescribing lifestyle changes, bariatric surgery, and medications to really prevent cirrhosis.
Yes, if I may echo what Jörn and Ken just said, I'm very happy to see that we started with the AASLD guideline last year, and now we have 4 different guidelines that are aligned on the use of the pathway FIB-4 than elastography. And I think this is very good news for the field, because if we want to go outside of the liver field and the diabetes field, this is a very important message to convey to the community, to convince, to raise the awareness of our colleague, and to increase the screening rate of NAFLD patients in this setting.
I think, I'm very encouraged with the baseline risk stratification developments using NITs. But, what's going to emerge next year is how we identify at-risk NASH, the patients that need to be treated with pharmacologic treatments. And I think by compiling the data from hopefully Regenerate and Maestro NASH, that we will have enough to really develop a pathway on how to monitor response to treatment with NITs without needing repeat biopsies. I was very happy to see that in the guidance also, they're talking about these NITs to identify at-risk NASH. So now we have 4 of them. We have the FAST, we have MeFib, we have the MAST, and then we have corrected T1. And I think this is going to be housed in specialty care, but I think we still need a little bit more data before we're confident how to utilize these. And I think that data will be generated next year.
Laurent had a fantastic paper that took a look at some of that, which has been discussed several times on this podcast, but not today. So I'm going to go back to the thing I've been saying, which is it's not only exciting that we'll have all these guidelines, but as commercial entities start to believe that we will have drugs and we will have a brighter future, money flows in. So not only will we have guidelines that have some common points, but I believe that there will be resources to educate a far broader audience far more aggressively than we've had in years past. You could feel some of that starting in 2019, and then Ella failed and OCA did not get approved, and everybody receded from that. But now we've got guidelines in place. We've got, I think, some decent consensus around what the important things to do are. There are still debates about the value of FIB-4. Last week on this podcast, there was a discussion from some people who I thought had been very strong on FIB-4 saying, gee, maybe we should look to go to FAST a lot earlier than we do right now in a lot of these patient populations. But they're assuming FIB-4 is already in place and widely used, which it isn't. I believe that the presence of the guidelines plus the commercial motivation to educate faster will lead us to make large amounts of progress very fast, very quickly. And with that, spoiler note to the audience, when we come back next week, it will be Thanksgiving week in the U.S. What better week to talk about nutrition? Shira Zelbersaki will be joining us to talk about the role of nutrition in all this. For you non-Americans, there's no bad week to talk about that. For you Americans, right before you sit down on Thursday for Thanksgiving and eat your 5,300 calorie fat, starch, and sugar-laden meals, listen to our episode when it drops Wednesday night and feel thoroughly guilty about what you're about to do. With that, let me thank everybody who's been with us today. Will, who's had to jump, and Naim, who's had to jump, and then Laurent, thank you, Wayne, Ken, Jörn, thanks for doing this from the car and then making your way home. I will be back with a business report in a couple of minutes, and everybody stay safe, surf on. See you soon. Bye-bye now.
And now for the Season 3, Episode 55 Business Report.
Slava Ukraini, Heroyam Slava, glory to Ukraine, glory to heroes. And as the Ukrainians welcome their soldiers back into Kherson, let's hope that those who say this may be the beginning of the end of this war are proven right over time.
If you lost track of William Alazawi in this recording, you're not alone.
We introduced Will Alazawi when he joined the recording session a bit late. He made several excellent comments. Other panelists referenced his presence and his research, and then he just vanished. Well, vanished from the recording at least. Will had such severe audio transmission problems that we could not keep him in the episode. He's a brilliant visionary guy with many interesting things to say and a unique perspective on where primary care fits into treatment. So we will work this week and next to resolve his bandwidth or audio issues so we can bring him back to you as part of a full episode soon.
This marks our last piece of coverage from AASLD 2022.
As you all know, this episode wraps up our coverage of the Liver Meeting 2022. It was an exhilarating event with a broad sweep of issues and some truly fantastic contributions to the field. I speak for our entire team and all our panelists when I say we are happy and proud to have been part of it.
Earlier today, we finished recording an advance episode for next week.
If you listen regularly, you probably know that we record on Monday afternoons. However, the episode you just heard was recorded last Friday, November 11th. Today, we have finished recording Season 3, Episode 56 with Shira Zelbersagi, Kent Cusi, Louise, and Jörn on the subject of NAFLD and nutrition, which is due to drop next week, the night before Thanksgiving in the U.S. We're testing advanced recording as a way to manage the time crunches that pop up around major conferences. Let us know whether it sounds older or stale or better or fresh or whatever.
From the Nash Tsunami Corrections Department, we have a juxtaposed number.
I reported 2 weeks ago that the third quarter had 24,924 downloads. Actually, I juxtaposed two numbers. It was 24,294. Not quite as close to 25,000 as the incorrect number, but pretty darn close.
That said, we still seem to be on the path to a 25,000 download quarter.
Halfway through the 46th afternoon of this 92-day quarter, we have 13,043 downloads, or about 285 a day. If we hold that average for the entire quarter, the quarter goes over 26,000, the year goes over 82,500, and we go over 122,500 total downloads since joining Buzzsprout in July of 2020. This thing just keeps growing and growing. We like it.
This week's Vault episode looks back at some prognostications the permanent co-hosts made last May.
Earlier this year, Jörn, Louise, and I were honored to serve as the wrap-up panel for NASH Day 2022 from the Global Liver Institute. In Season 3, Episode 29.2, we responded to two questions from our good friend Jeff McIntyre, who was moderating our panel. A discussion about the meaning and value of NASH Day's tagline, which was Stop NASH Now, followed by a really great question from Jeff. Describe the one thing that puts a twinkle in your eye that you see emerging over the next 3 to 5 years in NASH. It was a great opportunity for us to take stock 5 months ago. This episode has represented our next stock-taking opportunity. So, with that, I'm off. Thanks to the crew, Jake, Magic Mike, Eric, and Steve for pushing this episode out, and for the work we're all going to be doing to get the next episode out. Thanks to all our panelists throughout this episode who gave generously of their time and dealt with technology and all that stuff. So, until then, stay safe, surf on. We'll see you again next week on the podcast. Bye-bye now.
Have any questions for the surfers? You can send them to surfingnash.com, and we will answer on the podcast or the website.